going to get underway. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Marquette University Law School. I'm Mike Goucher, and as some of you know, this is On the Issues. This is our continuing series of conversations with news and policymakers, people who are doing interesting, important work in this region and beyond. And today, we're talking beyond Milwaukee in scope. Joining us is Bridget Brennan. Ms. Brennan is the Special Narcotics Prosecutor for the City of New York. It's a big job, and there's a lot going on right now in New York to talk about. We're going to do that. Also, we've got a few students in the room. We want to talk a little bit about Ms. Brennan's background, and we'd also like to welcome some of her family members who are here. She does have strong ties to Milwaukee, so it's nice to see some of the Brennan family. Won't you please give her a warm welcome to Marquette University Law School. And we should say right off the bat, we're glad you're here because I understand the weather in New York is not great right now.
I think if I had left this morning, I'd still be in New York.
You would still be in New York, but your son's enjoying it.
He's very much enjoying it. He's off of school today, so.
Snow days.
Yeah.
We have cold days now. It's so cold here that we just close schools because it's cold. So it's the new world we live in. So again, thanks so much for being with us today. I wanted to talk about a variety of subjects, but I wanted to begin by giving people in the audience some sense of the role of Special Narcotics Prosecutor. What is it? What do you do? What's the scope of it? Let's begin there.
Well, the Office of Special Narcotics was set up about 40 years ago when New York City was in the throes of a heroin epidemic. And there was a feeling in the state legislature that the drug crime was fueling all kinds of violent crime and property crime, and that there was no coordination of drug crime in New York City. New York City in particular has long been a source of narcotics distribution, certainly for New York State, New York City, throughout the East Coast. And so the view was if they set up a centralized office to coordinate narcotics prosecution, there would be some consistency in the way the cases were handled, and there would be a focus on the top of the pyramid rather than on the lowest level of the pyramid, and there would be some progress in the attempt to rein in the heroin epidemic. So that's the way the office came to be set up. And of course, New York City, being what it is, has been the center of a number of drug epidemics since then, so there's been no shortage of business since we kind of reined in that heroin problem back at that time.
Well, let's talk about the new heroin problem because sadly, this conversation is quite timely. Many of you in this room know about the death of the actor Philip Seymour Hoffman earlier this month, a heroin overdose. And I think that put a spotlight on the problem of heroin. Describe the nature of the problem that you're seeing right now in New York.
Well, again, just keeping in mind that what my office does is focus on narcotics importation and the higher levels of the chain. What we had seen starting about 4 years ago were big, what we call mills, heroin mills, pumping out hundreds of thousands of little bags, glassine envelopes of heroin that were intended for distribution throughout New York City and throughout the East Coast. And these were mills that were unlike anything we had ever seen before and unlike anything any of our investigators had seen even during the first epidemic in the 70s. It was a huge volume. And so we knew at that time that ultimately we were going to see a huge problem with addiction and overdose.
And so these mills, describe the workings of a mill. When you describe that, what are you talking about?
Well, interestingly, the mills that we've seen are often set up in locations where you would never expect to find it. It would be in a suburban New Jersey location, a middle-class area of the Bronx, someplace where the narcotics importers and the ones that we are focusing on in New York are often Colombian. They're very smart, they're very savvy, and they know that they can hide in plain view in locations that where they wouldn't be expected. And so they would be found maybe in, one example was one we found in Fort Lee, New Jersey, which was in a suburban location where the workers in the mill would be shift workers. They'd be collected from northern Manhattan or the Bronx, and taken to the New Jersey location in a van every morning. They would be able to pull into an enclosed garage, the door would go down, they would come out, and they would start their work. And they would bag up the heroin, stamp the glassines with little stamps, we called them brands, and then they would bag up. They'd first mix the heroin with some kind of diluent, something like lactose, baking powder, whatever, baking soda, I mean, and that would be done with coffee grinders. One of the things we typically find at these locations is dozens and dozens and dozens of little mini coffee grinders, many of them with burnt out motors from mixing all these, from mixing all the heroin up. And then there was a bagging operation. When the officers hit the search warrant on the location, they found a child in a high chair eating cereal, the mom right next to him stamping stamps on bags, and in the next room in operation a glass top with the mixed heroin and cut, and a little tiny spoon that they were using to measure exactly how much heroin was going to go in the bag. And that mill was producing literally hundreds of thousands of glassines of heroin.
You just made a recent bust. In fact, I think it was right before the Philip Seymour Hoffman death. A pretty substantial bust in the Bronx. Again, one of these heroin mills doing its thing.
Yeah, in that case, I think it's terrible. I can't remember if we seized 23 pounds of heroin or 33 pounds of heroin because it's been just pouring in recently. But in that one, we seized a tremendous amount of heroin. And again, that was a location that we had some confidential information was operating, but no one knew walking into it what it was they were going to find. When the officers showed up on the scene, they saw a suspicious-looking guy who they questioned in the lobby. He went back to a particular apartment. They had officers stationed outside who saw somebody climbing out the fire escape of that apartment. And then they got a search warrant, went in and found a completely well-equipped mill with the coffee grinders. And one telltale sign is garbage bags on the windows. They refer to those as mill curtains among the investigators, because you typically do find the windows are kind of blacked out. But we found these mills in the Times Square area in a very posh apartment in the Times Square area not long ago. They're hidden in plain view.
Who's using heroin today?
Well, there's been a long-term problem among certain groups of, kind of very impoverished and desperate individuals, and we've seen that long-term problem and haven't been able to make a lot of headway there. But the new group of users of heroin is young, educated, suburban, blue-collar, middle class. It's a very different kind of user than we had traditionally seen in all the years that I've been doing these cases. The heroin is much purer now, and so it can be snorted to get high, and that is more attractive, certainly to someone starting out in heroin use. They don't want to start out with a syringe and a needle in the arm. And so maybe they start out snorting the heroin. It's powerful enough to give an effective high. And then, as time goes on, they develop a tolerance for it. They want more to get that same high that they had the first time by snorting. And ultimately, you do see a progression to intravenous use.
And it's cheap, isn't it? In New York
Yes.
City, it's very cheap?
Yes. It's a function of supply. The streets are flooded with heroin in certain areas. And if there's a flood of it, it's going to be at a lower price. In the common parlance among investigators is to refer to a dime bag of heroin, a bag that costs $10. Well, now those dime bags in some neighborhoods go for $7. Certain areas in New Jersey that are blue collar, very hard hit, Patterson, New Jersey, a dime bag goes for $6. And so there's a lot of it out there, and it's pretty cheap.
I wanted to explore the point you made earlier, and that is that where this drug is showing up. I mean, there are people in this room who know this to be the case. It's not necessarily a city of Milwaukee problem anymore. It is a problem, certainly, in the city. but it's a problem in the county. We had a young woman in Whitefish Bay High School die. We've had a number of overdoses in Zaki County, Waukesha County. It really is no longer this, what was, I think, thought to be this very urban drug. It's much different than that today.
It's very much different than that. The demographic for who the new initiates are, I mean, and that's all clinical language that doesn't begin to capture, obviously, the tragedy of heroin addiction, but the new user is young, relatively well-educated, middle class or blue collar, and one of the things that we see when you look at drug trends is a phenomenon that's referred to as generational amnesia. If you've grown up in a situation where you've seen your uncle, your father, loved ones developing addiction and struggling with a certain drug, you want nothing to do with that drug, and often you will turn away from it. Well, it's now been quite a long time since we've suffered through a heroin epidemic, and I think the new user, for one thing, is kind of desensitized to heroin. They haven't seen much of it. They don't have to inject it. And there's sort of a normalization, I think, or an acceptance of that kind of drug use that promotes experimentation, which leads to a dependence and an addiction and all the problems that we're seeing now, I think.
Talk, if you would, Bridget, about the relationship between prescription drug abuse and heroin. There is a connection there, is there not?
Yeah. The painkillers that we are seeing abused on a very wide scale are prescription painkillers that have it's called an opioid component. Some people call it heroin in a pill. The basic thing in that drug is very similar to heroin. And so once someone develops an appetite or a dependence on the opioid, the opiate drug, they may at some point turn to heroin to satisfy that dependence when the pill becomes too expensive to buy out on the street.
How big a problem is this today, is the prescription drug abuse, the problem of opioids in New York?
It's huge. We looked at the statistics a couple of years ago. Part of my job, obviously, is to look at trends and try to direct our resources to where we see the problems are. And I started to see in our seizures that we were taking big, huge catches of pills, hundreds of pills at a time, and from locations where I never would have expected to see them, in housing developments, housing projects. We'd hit a search warrant and seize all these pills. We have in New York delivery services where you can call up, order your marijuana, order your cocaine, it's delivered to you. Well, in those investigations, we would find fentanyl patches, which are the patches that cancer patients use, but they were being delivered to customers. So we started to see it come up in all kinds of ways. So then I looked at the data. We have a very pretty good prescription monitoring program in New York State. I started to look at how many prescriptions, not pills, but prescriptions there were for these opiate pills, just one type, oxycodone, for New Yorkers in the prior year. And for a city of about 8.5 million, and that includes, children, in the past year there had been 1 million prescriptions, not pills, prescriptions. And that was up from less than 500,000 just a couple of years earlier. So I knew where the problem was coming from at that point. See, I was trying to identify, did somebody just steal a big load of oxycodone and start flooding the streets with it? Where was it coming from? And so that clearly pointed me in the direction of looking at the medical profession. It's not just doctors, because prescriptions can obviously be stolen, they can be forged, but no matter what, it wasn't somebody stealing a big load off a truck. So we started to really focus our efforts on that.
And what have you seen in terms of, are there simply, I assume there are some doctors who are just simply looking the other way. They know that people are not using them probably to solely take care of a pain problem. They know there's something else going on here. They're not asking a lot of questions. What do you do about that? How do you identify these doctors and put them out of business?
Well, I guess what we really looked for is the high-volume doctor, which is typically not just one who is turning a blind eye, but one who is, excuse me, actively profiting from this, the sale of the prescription. So we looked at doctors who were not offering any medical service whatsoever, but were just basically pumping out prescriptions. That's our initial focus. At the same time, we worked on a committee. Mayor Bloomberg set up a committee that involved prosecutors, police, and the health department to try to reach out to doctors who might have been less responsible than they should have been in terms of prescribing practices, and tried to sensitize them to the real terrible harm that it was causing, and develop new strategies and protocols. So we approach these cases like we approach any other. We would have confidential information from sources who might tell us about doctors selling prescriptions, and then we would zero in and look at that practice. We would obtain data, and just to give you a sense of it, one doctor whom we have since indicted, when we started to look at his practice, he was a full-time anesthesiologist in New Jersey and operated a pain management clinic just one day a week on Saturdays in an area of New York and Queens. And so that one day a week, he would open his practice at about 8 o'clock, and it would look like the old heroin lines looked in the 70s and the 80s, with a line of people who were clearly dependent on drugs waiting for him to show up. And we could send investigators out to surveil these locations and try to get inside. He had been become a little wary because the DEA had notified him that some of his practices were out of line. And so there was only so much we could do directly with investigators, but we developed some confidential informants. Among the things we learned was that patients were given the kind of numbers that you get at a grocery store or a deli line or, at the meat counter, and they would be called by number and not by name. There was a sign posted up on the wall that said if you get a certain number of milligrams, you'll be charged 120 milligrams of opioid, you'll be charged $125 cash. If you get more than that, or if it's been reported to him that you were seeing other doctors and getting drugs from other doctors, you'll be deemed a complicated case and your fee will go up to $250. And so clearly he was just selling the prescriptions. As we got further into that case, we also had learned from some of the patients and their families that people had died. And really, by hand, my investigators went out and collected data from the medical examiner's offices throughout New York City and learned that in the 2-year period that we were looking at, 16 of his patients had overdosed and died. Now, of course, being lawyers and prosecutors, we don't know, we don't have a framework for analyzing that, so we brought in experts who could kind of guide us. And we asked them, is that a lot of people to die? And the doctor turned to me, he said, 1 is a lot to die. 16 when you're seeing patients 1 day a week? Yeah, that's a lot to die. So we, again, really dug into putting this case together and ultimately did indict him for selling the prescriptions, but also we brought manslaughter charges against him in connection with the deaths of some of the individuals who had very, very extreme cases where he had been notified that the patient had overdosed, was called by the hospital, and continued to prescribe, actually in higher amounts than he had previously prescribed. So, we have to approach it the same way we approach any other case.
Besides law enforcement, based on your experience, what else do we do about the problem of heroin? What else do we do about the problem of prescription drug abuse? You have a strong belief in rehabilitation, do you not?
Absolutely. In our, more traditional drug programs or drug offenses, we've had alternative to incarceration programs run in my office for many, many years. So I'm a strong believer in rehabilitation, but what we're looking at is the top of the supply chain in terms of really punishing those people who are using their medical license to sell drugs. But I think that's an effective deterrent. Whereas to the street drug dealer who kind of has nothing to lose and maybe in desperate circumstances, you know, there's people will say that if you lock up one dealer, there'll be 3 more to take his place, et cetera, et cetera. I don't think the same is true of doctors. So I do think when we draw attention to our prosecutions of doctors, it does have a strong deterrent effect. With respect to the user, though, now that I think a targeted education program to these users, both of the opioid drugs, again, that user group is young and educated, and the young heroin user, we can reach them through effective education programs, I think, because the answer has to be prevention, plus now dealing with this terrible tragedy of addiction that we're now facing.
Give us a sense of what's happened to what I think probably people in this room think of as the more traditional drug trade in New York. Cocaine, crack, things like that. Do you have that sort of knocked down to a point where you feel better about it? What's the state of affairs?
I went to New York 30 years ago. I grew up in Milwaukee, had never set foot in New York City before I went for an interview in the New York County District Attorney's office in Manhattan. And what I saw when I stepped off the plane and was going to stay with a friend was kind of unbelievable to me. It looked like a third world city to me. And there was a sense of menace in the city at the time, which continued through much of my tenure, my first 10 years in that office. I handled homicide cases, sex crimes cases, all kinds of cases. And at the root of many of those violent crimes that I handled was drugs. It was all drugs. And then suddenly, well, it wasn't because I went over to narcotics and started handling these big narcotics cases. That was one of the reasons I wanted to handle the major narcotics cases, because I wanted to try to cut off this problem at the source rather than cleaning up the back end of it all the time. And then we really did turn the corner and got the crime problem, the drug. It started with really focusing in relentlessly on the open street trade of drugs, which attracted a lot of violence. And a big supply of drugs is going to attract a big user group. So once we could contain that, and we did that with relentless prosecutions, really kind of block by block, neighborhood by neighborhood, working on those cases. And we reined in the crack problem pretty well. Not that it doesn't, you know, there are some problems still. Of course there are, there always will be. But compared to what it was when I came in, it's astounding. Just to give you a sense of it, when I was a homicide prosecutor in Manhattan, well, certainly we had hundreds of homicides a year. Last year, I think there were 40 homicides in Manhattan. So, you know, we did something right. It started with that intense focus on reining in the drug crews that were creating all kinds of havoc in the neighborhood, and they were magnets for violence. And then the peripheral effects of it, you know, people who were addicted to those drugs, people who were on those drugs were causing all kinds of violent crimes. So we managed to rein that in. So we've had big successes, I think, in many of the areas that we focused on, and certainly it gives me hope that we can apply some of these same tools to the problems that we're facing now.
I'm interested in hearing you talk about the way you took on that problem in the 80s and the progress you made on it, and it's a very professional explanation, but I want to ask you a personal question. When you were prosecuting the kinds of crimes that stem from drugs, was it tough to deal with? Was it, I think people in this room sometimes, you know, if you're an attorney and the kinds of cases you're handling on a daily basis, we have people from the DA's office here, it's not easy. Is it tough personally to continue to prosecute those kinds of crimes?
It was extraordinarily difficult. When I applied to the DA's office, you know, fresh from Wisconsin, written all over my face and in my accent as well, the chief assistant asked me, "Can you handle the underbelly of life?" And I said, "Well, sure, who can't handle the underbelly of life?" But I came to really understand what that meant, and it's extraordinarily draining, because as a prosecutor, you're dealing with the victims of terrible crimes, and sometimes those victims are young children, or it's the family of someone who is senselessly killed, and you have compassion for them and empathy, and at the same time your job is to turn the information that they're giving you into facts and break it down very clinically into facts that you can turn into evidence, that you can produce at trial so that you can get a conviction, et cetera, et cetera. And so all your human response, of course, is to just throw out your hands and say, what a terrible thing. And you do feel like you're there to mop up a terrible mess, a terrible traumatizing situation with very few tools to do it. You have very little to offer these people in terms of relief. I mean, is it really going to make someone feel better that you get a conviction in a case? Maybe. But that is of small solace, to a 4-year-old child who's been sexually abused, or to a mom who's lost her son to stupid, senseless gun violence. It doesn't really comfort them. And so what I've found through the years is you really have to take the long view. And I try with my young assistants to, we have young attorneys coming into our office, and try to give them, the kind of support and guidance, and also advise them to take the long view. Short term, you're dealing with very difficult circumstances, but in the long run, I think we've made big contributions.
What drew you to public service law? I think students in this room would be wanting to know that.
I was always interested in public service, and I'm not sure exactly why. I think probably my mom sitting over there and my family, who had a lot to do with that. I think we grew up with a sense that it's important to give back in some way, however it is, whether you do that through public service or in some other way. And what drew me to the DA's office was a fascinating place. I'd been a reporter. As you know, you and I, Mike and I were young reporters together. We also went through journalism school together. We first met, I think, maybe our second year or third year in journalism school. But what attracted me to journalism was that fast pace. Getting to the bottom of a story, trying to give clarity to the public to something that was of importance. And a lot of those same considerations come into play when you're working in criminal justice. When I was in law school, I worked in a program where we were assisting incarcerated people. And I looked at the defense side, and I have great respect for defense attorneys. I think they do a tremendous job and a tremendous service. The trauma that I felt, I think, in dealing with my cases is equal, if not surpassed, by the difficulties that they must confront. But it wasn't for me. I kind of like to be in charge, and I wanted to be the one who was marshaling the facts, marshaling the case, not in a position of defending my client against charges. But criminal justice always attracted me, and the Manhattan DA's office is just a fascinating place where certainly at that time you got tremendous experience very quickly.
Describe the law school experience for you, because you had been out, as you said, working professionally as a journalist. You clearly made a decision. You said, I think I want to do something else or look at doing something else. What was the law school experience like for you?
Well, part of the reason I went to law school, in fact, the main reason I went, was I wanted to be a better journalist. I found myself covering court cases when I really didn't know what I was talking about. I mean, I didn't know what the terms meant, really. I didn't know what an arraignment was. At one point, I reported on air that a defendant was released on his own reconnaissance, not recognizance. And a judge wrote me a long letter.
He didn't see the...
He explained the difference. So I thought to myself, maybe I ought to know what I'm talking about. I'm not so sure that would matter these days, but it did. It did to me then. So I went to law school. While I was at law school, I was always working. I worked in radio. I did weekend radio stints doing news. And then I worked for public radio in Madison while I was in law school, and ultimately took a lot of criminal law classes, partly because that's where I thought that's where I would be covering those kinds of stories. I had a great law professor who interested me in getting into a career in criminal justice. But
famous guy in his own right.
Yeah.
You've had a couple of them. You've had interesting experiences with.
This professor was Frank Turkheimer. I had him for a couple of classes, and back then we didn't have email, we didn't have any of that. He left a note for me on the board saying, "Why don't you come and talk to me?" And I went to talk to him, and he said, "Have you ever thought of working in the Manhattan DA's office?" I said, "No, I've never been to Manhattan." He said, "Well, why don't you think about it and let me know?" So I thought about it. I thought, you know what? I don't have a job. It's March. In journalism, you wouldn't look for a job until you're ready to go into your job, but why not check it out? And I went there and was tremendously impressed with the office, the opportunities it offered. And so from arriving in New York on a Wednesday, flying home on a Saturday, on Friday night, Robert Morgenthau offered me the job, and I accepted on the spot. And I have to admit, I cried all the way back home on the plane, thinking, how can I ever live in that city? But here it is 30 years later, and somehow I've managed. So yes, I've been very, very fortunate in my career.
What did you learn from your mentors? What were the qualities that they instilled in you, whether it was Professor Turkheimer or District Attorney Morgenthau?
From both of them, just a tremendous commitment to integrity. As a prosecutor, you take the case wherever it takes you. You don't try to shape the facts, you don't try to shape the evidence, and you live with the results. And if you're going to take a hit on it, if it's going to be something that doesn't look good for you, just brace yourself and get it over with, and just, forge ahead. And take the long view. I mean, don't just get so involved in one individual case that you don't pick up your head and get a perspective on it, and see where this particular prosecution fits in the scheme of things, where this defendant fits in the scheme of things. Don't get so focused in this prosecution or this case that you lose your sense of justice.
Can you highly recommend public service to the students in this room? We have many of them who would like to work for a district attorney, would like to be a public defender. Can you recommend it? I mean, you've been at it a while.
There's nothing better. There's nothing better than the feeling that you're doing something that's important, that matters to people, that will make a difference in their lives. There's just nothing better than that. And so whatever area of public service that you work in, if you have clarity in your mind that that's the goal that you're working towards, I can think of no better way to kind of shape your career. You're never going to get rich that way, though. Marry well, that would be my recommendation.
Let's take some questions from the audience. Please raise your hand. If you're in the seating bowl, just press down on the little rim, keep your finger down on it, and we'll take your question. Yes.
What can the citizenry do to help district attorneys' offices in Milwaukee and across the country? What would make it easier for them, or smoother, or what can we do?
Well, I think in the broadest sense, you know, it's always a partnership. I mean, law enforcement should never be imposed on people. In the broadest sense, it really is a partnership between what the community wants in terms of controls and safety and their commitment to it. And so I think the best thing that an individual can do is become engaged. I'm not familiar with the specific ways to do that here in Milwaukee. I know that in New York, every precinct has a precinct council. There are many different ways that the individual can become involved. And if you see something that you know is of danger in your community, you should reach out and tell law enforcement about it. I mean, if you have a drug dealer next door to you, or you kind of want to shut your eyes and it feels menacing to you. But on the other hand, not only can that put you in jeopardy, it puts your whole community in jeopardy. There are ways to make that information available anonymously. Certainly there are in my office, and I'm sure there are here in this city as well. But I don't think you should ever feel that you're just an observer to the process. When you get a jury service notice, it's important that people who feel commitment serve. So there are many, many ways, I think, in which you can help. But the most important one is to demonstrate your commitment in some way.
Mm-hmm. Other questions? Let me go right back there. Yeah. Wait for the microphone, if you would, please.
Thank you. Thank you. I think you had mentioned earlier that when you have gone on some of the drug busts that they actually are putting stamps on the bag, and I think that they found some stamps on the pieces that Philip Seymour Hoffman had. Why do they do that?
We've always seen heroin stamped, and I think some of it is to build customer loyalty to a particular brand. Some of it now, I mean, the sort of stamps that we see now, just to give you a perspective on it, there's two kinds of stamps that I typically see. One would be the Grim Reaper, Lethal Weapon, all kinds of allusions to death. And the other is Lady Gaga, Chanel, very NFL, Obamacare. Topical, again, it shows who they're trying to appeal to, right? A younger, more kind of hip user group. And so now, Philip Seymour Hoffman, those stamps were very high-end stamps, I have to say. They were very colorful. It was an ace of spades, but it was much less cartoonish than the stamps that I typically see. But a lot of it is just to build a consumer loyalty, although the brands are completely fungible. They mean nothing. When we hit a search warrant, we'll seize, 30, 40 different stamps, and somebody said, they don't mean anything. It's the same heroin, different stamps. Nobody requests a particular stamp. It's not like you're putting in your order for a bottle of wine and I want mine done this way and, personalized in some way. It has nothing to do with that. It's all about marketing.
Mm-hmm. We'll go right back there since Ryan's standing back there. Yeah.
Bridget, in what ways has your office dealt with the, I'd say, subculture of not snitching as promoted among communities, neighborhoods, and also in certain elements of hip-hop music?
That makes it very, very difficult. In the other kind of case that we focus on, aside from the high-level narcotics organization, are the violent gangs. And that's where you hear that over and over. And so we try to build our evidence in other ways. Typically, if you have a homicide that's committed in a drug gang, your witnesses are going to be members of that gang. And so if the culture is one of intimidation, you're not going to get those people to testify who observed it. Sometimes you can if you have enough, we call it leverage, if you have a very significant crime that they're facing, and instead of doing very significant amount of prison time. To get a reduced sentence, you might be able to get them to give information. But we've also developed new tools in order to get evidence. We focus a lot on social media. What we find, particularly with the violent gangs, is that a lot of it is about intimidation, but in order to intimidate, they have to be heard. So they'll be putting out the threats on social media, on Twitter, texting. Once we get the phones, if we seize a phone after an arrest, there's a tremendous amount of information contained within the phone, pictures. The pictures will identify, and sometimes they even take pictures of, guns and themselves holding guns and crazy stuff that sensible people wouldn't do, but the whole point is intimidation and to show that you're the biggest and baddest guy. So we try to develop information that way as well.
I'm going to get down here. I guess we could do this, John. Go ahead.
How would easing the penalties on marijuana or actually legalizing it affect what you're doing? Would it leave more prosecutors and law enforcement to go after the heroin and the cocaine? Or would it create a worse problem?
Well, my office doesn't handle marijuana. We're narcotics, which is basically defined as heroin and cocaine and opiate drugs and that sort of thing. I don't think that a lot of prosecutorial resources are devoted to marijuana now. I have to talk about New York because those are the laws I'm familiar with. Each state is really different now. If it wasn't different before, certainly after what Washington has done and Colorado has done, it's a lot different now. But just to give you a sense of it, in New York State, even if you have 2 tons of marijuana, the highest level offense you're facing is a C felony for which you can get probation or you can get nothing. I mean, you can get a conditional discharge. So as it stands now, marijuana is not a major focus for law enforcement, except that because marijuana is much more unregulated, it often is at the root of a lot of violent crime. A lot of the violent organizations that we see are selling marijuana. There's a lot of money in marijuana and not a whole lot of risk. And so we see open street marketing of marijuana, open marketing and not hiding it, which is, again, it's the crime magnet. But I don't see a lot of enforcement resources devoted to marijuana purely to get rid of marijuana. How would I see legalization affecting us? My problem, I don't think marijuana is good for people. I certainly don't think it's good for young people, developing brains, teenagers, adolescents, and all that. And I don't think we have a whole lot of research on that subject. So, I don't think it's great to have another thing that's not so good for you out there being marketed. Remember, if we start marketing marijuana, you're not going to market, the marketers are going to be marketing heavy use of it. They're not going to be marketing like, oh, go have a joint one day a week. There's no money in that. So once we put it over into the whole array of the same focus as we had with tobacco and alcohol and everything else, you're going to see more use. So I guess I would see that going up. And the other problem I see would be just more normalization of drug use, which we have just overwhelmingly relaxed attitudes about it now, which leads us to some of these other issues that we're seeing. However, I do think that what we've got now is, in a sense, the worst of all worlds, where you have 2 states doing one thing, all the other states doing something else. That leads to a real cynicism about the laws. And a sense of what's going on here anyway, certainly within our own country. And when I deal with people from other countries, we frequently have international visitors. They are completely confused, and they think that we are, I recently had South Korean visitors in, and they have a lot of military bases in South Korea. And so they were trying to understand what's going on in the States because they see military personnel with marijuana, thinking marijuana is legal. And so the confusion that we have now, I think, is just overwhelmingly bad on every level, both for the people, our citizenry, for law enforcement, for for good, effective drug policy, thoughtful drug policy. I think that's bad.
I don't want to ignore any of my friends on this side of the room here. We'll go down here and then I'll come back over. Yeah, go ahead. Thank you.
What effect has the Stop, Question, Frisk programs had on your job?
The Stop, Question, Frisk program didn't really affect the kind of work that I do. That really focused more on lower level. When a police officer would see kind of a lower level crime or something he believed might be a crime, a gun possession or something else, then they would stop and question and frisk. But we never saw those kinds of cases in my office. So per se, I didn't really have much, it didn't really affect us too much. And even, kind of long, broader effects, it's too early to judge whether the long-term problem with it is if it does mean that there are more guns out on the street. What I've seen with the violent gangs that we've prosecuted who are doing drug dealing is they are so quick to whip out the guns. And they did keep the guns, maybe still do, hidden in different places. They would trade the guns among themselves. The gun would belong to the gang and not to an individual. And they'd keep moving it around for fear the police would get the gun. And then after a shooting, all the texts would go across, did the gun get home safe? Not did my friend get home safe, not did this one get home safe, did the gun get home safe? And so I do think that stop and frisk policies did put a damper on just bringing the guns out. And to the extent that you had guns hidden inside, you didn't have impulsive young people whipping them out and shooting each other. And so I did see in intercepted texts in evidence that we collected that there was a deterrent effect. But, the question is always, was the cost too high? And we'll see whether the gun violence remains suppressed in New York as a result.
And crime still is.
Crime is still low. Yep.
In a long time.
In a long time. I have to say it's something really, really rewarding to have been a part of, to see the city change into the city it is now compared to what it was during a lot of the time that I was there. I mean, when I live in New York City, always have, and in a nice area of New York City, which I thought always. But of course, even in those areas, bad things would happen. Right after my first child was born, my mother came out to help me, and she was there for a week. When I wanted to drive her back to the airport, I went out to get my car, take my mom back to the airport, and guess what? My car had been stolen. Overnight, we had to call a cab. And it was recovered much later with a gun in the trunk. The ignition punched out. And just to give you a sense of what it was like, when I went to pick up my car, I had my daughter in a snuggly, on my chest and strapped in, and I went to pick up my car, and I had my keys with me, and I go to if I hadn't picked it up that day, the police were going to tow it to the pound, and it takes forever to get it out of that. So anyway, I had the keys, my baby, and I go to get my car, and the cop looks at me, he said, well, you know how to drive it with a screwdriver, don't you?
New York.
I mean, he just assumes you live in New York, you know how to drive it with a screwdriver. So no, I didn't. And then I had to get the car towed. But those days I have to, and then once I got it towed and put it back on my street in front of my house where it had been stolen, not long after that, I went out to find a hypodermic needle and a tourniquet in the front seat of my car. So that doesn't happen anymore. I did have all the tires stolen off my car not that long ago, but it was up on blocks. Whoever had stolen it had nicely elevated it, stolen the tires, and I appreciated that. It wasn't too badly damaged.
The city of New York thanks you for this. But it is a very different place than it was in the early 80s. There's no question about that.
There's just no question about it. You do not have a sense of menace walking down the street. You feel I have kids, and I want my kids to grow up not feeling that there's danger lurking behind each corner. And they don't, and we live in the city, and they're able to take advantage of all the richness that New York City has to offer, and so that's wonderful. And the sense of the city is so much different now. It's a wonderful city in so many different ways. The obvious ways, all the shows and all that, but the great diversity in cultures and ethnic groups, and how people are right up next to each other, bumping up against each other relatively peacefully is quite wonderful. So if you haven't been there, come and visit. It's nice and safe. A lot of good things to do.
Great. A few more questions. Yes, sir.
If importing is such a problem, what are we doing about that? Importing drugs, heroin, example.
Well, we work, just to give you a perspective on it, in the 1990s, we started to see the Colombian cartels bringing over chemists who knew how to refine heroin. And then they started producing heroin, whereas previously, most of the heroin we saw in New York came from Asia. There was a shift in the 90s, which I think is partly responsible for the high volume, because the cartels already had their roots established, and they had their retailers set up in the States, and they could just, get in there and start pumping it out. So what are we doing? We work with, in my office, we work with the DEA, and we work cases with prosecutors in Panama, in Colombia. We work with Mexico when it's vetted very carefully. So we try to collaborate to the extent we can. I mean, look, the United States is, we have many, many different ways drugs can get in. So the answer, of course, does lie in tamping down the supply by working collaboratively with partners. But it has to also, the answer has to be in prevention. We have to tamp down the appetite for drugs because we can't close off every avenue that drugs can come in. And so we're working both ways, but we do work collaboratively with international partners.
Just time for a couple more questions. We'll go right back here, this gentleman. Hang on 1 second, we'll wait for the microphone.
What is the role of pharmacists and pharmacies in controlling the abuse of prescription medications since electronic records? Milwaukee probably has Aurora and CVS and Walgreens that must cover a huge percentage of the population, for example.
We've worked very cooperatively with a lot of pharmacists. I think there's a bit of irony in this. The pharmacist is, in a sense, on the front line of the problem. The pharmacist is obviously the one filling the prescription. But the pharmacist is presented with an order, with a prescription, and if the pharmacist is dealing with someone who's desperate to get those drugs, that person can be quite menacing. But we get a lot of calls from pharmacists. From the big, from the Walgreens and the Walmarts, I would say the individual pharmacist, same thing, they'll call if they see, well, we recently had a case where the prescription was a fraudulent prescription. It had been produced on somebody's computer, but very well done. However, instead of saying controlled substance on the bottom, it said controlled audience. Who knows why? But in any event, so when an astute pharmacist noticed that, we got calls. And so the pharmacist certainly can help, but I don't think you can expect a pharmacist to be right there on the front lines between, a desperate patient, a desperate addict, really holding the line there. I just don't see that. I think the pharmacists, though, can and do have provided us with a lot of information. Now, on the more corporate level, I will tell you that we ran a case where there was a doctor in New York and his office manager who were both writing prescriptions, and the prescriptions were being sold to distribution rings. One was in Pennsylvania, and the distribution ring was getting most of their prescriptions filled at a Walmart, and was completely draining the Walmart of oxycodone. So much so that there was none left for the legitimate, the regular pain patients, and they would set the drugs for the pain patient aside so that the drug ring wouldn't get all of it. But in that instance, I think Walmart, it's not the little individual, pharmacist. I thought that they could have done more in terms of a more effective response. But it's tough. The whole area is fraught with problems because you have a lot of confidentiality and a right to pain medication, right to alleviate your pain. I mean, it's fraught with all kinds of complications. So I think this is an area where we really need collaboration rather than finger pointing. I try not to do too much of it. I take back what I just said about Walmart.
Final question. Yes.
Here in Milwaukee and throughout southeast Wisconsin, there have been quite a few summits on the nature of heroin, the problem of heroin, and I was just wondering, from your perspective, what would you recommend that folks talk about there? It's law enforcement, prosecutors, treatment providers. What types of issues do you think they should be focusing on in these summits?
I think what you asked, if I heard you right, is what should the focus be of these prevention task forces? The most effective prevention efforts that I've seen are directed at young people and are kind of peers, or maybe not peers, then kind of cultural heroes who can speak about the problems that they've had and the real dangers of it. I've worked with Chris Herron. Does anybody know who Chris Herron is? Okay.
Former basketball player.
Former basketball player, played for the Knicks, developed a painkiller addiction and then a heroin addiction. And now ESPN did a big special on him. And he does a lot of programs with high school students, which is where I think the prevention efforts ought to be directed, as well as college students. But I think where I see it starting really is in high school. So I think that kind of a speaker who can talk to young people who will really be able to hold their attention, rather than somebody like me, who has a lot of wisdom, don't get me wrong, but they won't hear what I have to say or think it has validity. I think if you can find that kind of a person to share their experience, and the young person can relate to it and say, that could be me too, I think we'll have more success with those kinds of informational efforts.
I'm going to wrap things up right there. Before we say thank you to Bridget Brennan, I did want to mention a couple of events have been added to the schedule here at the law school. Next week we have Police Chief Ed Flynn here on Tuesday. He'll be talking about sort of the state of the fight against crime in Milwaukee, where last year was a bit of an aberration. Then we've also added on March 17th, that's a Monday, we're going to have Congressman Reed Ribble, Republican from the Fox Valley, and Congressman Mark Pocan, a Democrat from Madison, will be here. They are working together in Washington as part of something called the No Labels Problem Solvers. They're trying to actually, as they say, fix problems rather than just simply fight about problems. And so they'll be here on the 17th of March. And then on the 25th, we'll hear from the Democratic candidate for governor, Mary Burke. And we'll also be adding more events to the schedule as we move forward, law.marquette.edu. I would like to say thanks to all of you for coming again today. We always love to have you here. And a special thanks to my former college classmate and the current special prosecutor for narcotics in the city of New York, Bridget Brennan. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Mike. nice fun.